Before I start my talk, I'd like to give the usual standard disclaimer. These are my opinions. Some people have found them valuable, but generally they've usually got me into trouble. These don't necessarily reflect who I work for, and this may contain some very, very terrible code. Anyway, hello, my name is Tef, and I am a very bad programmer. I forget to write documentation, I forget to write tests, and I've written an awful lot of bugs. The first Ruby program I ever wrote was made fun of on Twitter, and somebody went, "That looks like a Python programmer struggling to understand Ruby," and they were right. The next slide carries a health warning. If you are sensitive to terrible code, I recommend looking away now. This is a line of code I wrote, not more than a year ago. This was in production for 6 months. There was a big deadline, things were very rushed, and in the end, this was all I could do to make the code work. Eventually, I got rid of it a couple of months later, but in that time, my coworker saw this and went, "Ugh." And his first instinct was to copy and paste this onto a forum where we both hung out and going, "Look what this man has done. He should feel bad." And then he saw the comment above, "Ugh," and realized I already felt that bad. There was no need for further public shaming. But if I'm a bad programmer, what makes a good programmer? Thankfully, loudmouths on the internet have worked out what the difference is between a good and a bad programmer. So let's just go through some of them. Paul Graham came up with something called the Blub paradox, or if you don't use Lisp, you can never be as clever as Paul Graham paradox. He argued that programming was a form of 1984 newspeak, or that the programming you use limits the way in which you can think. Coincidentally, the Lisp program that he wrote was so unmaintainable, so not understandable by mere mortal programmers, that Yahoo, after a year of inheriting his system, rewrote it from scratch in Perl to make it understandable and maintainable. Then again, Paul Graham has also said a couple of things, like if airplanes were more like Lisp, September the 11th, 2001 wouldn't have happened. So I'd be very hesitant to take programming advice about what is good and what is bad from someone who sees a plane going into a building and goes, "You know what that means? More people should use Lisp." Another famous loudmouth, Steve Yegg, came up with this idea that instead of talking about good and bad programmers, he would talk about conservative and liberal programmers. At once, he had found a new form of debate beyond tabs and spaces where no programmer had gone before into a level of absolute ignorance. Instead of using terms that we understood, we decided to use terms that we didn't understand, political terms, emotionally charged terms. And so instead of people actually talking about how they design software, they just started screaming at each other. "You don't understand, you're a conservative, I'm a software libertarian, I don't have to take your rules." Now, the thing is why do we end up dividing this world into good and bad programmers, and why do so many people do this? The answer is it gets you a lot of blog hits. Everyone likes an easy answer to a really hard question. But this isn't the worst sort of division that goes on. The worst sort of division is this one. Dave Weiner wrote a piece saying, "I don't understand the world, but I have an idea why there aren't so many women in programming, and it's about cavemen." The level of ignorance Dave Weiner displayed on a normal day-to-day basis did not compare to what actually happened here. It turns out that Dave Weiner had not done any historical research on programming or humanity in general. He forgot that women were the first computers, sitting in rows doing complex calculations by hand. And then when we automated it, women were the first programmers. It wasn't until the 70s and 80s that women were driven out of programming as it became a high-status job. He also declared that cavemen, men went out hunt, women went out look after a baby. But as it turns out, those ideas we have about cavemen really come from Victorian archaeologists. Just recently, a mummy was found holding a spear. So everybody went, that was a man warrior. Months later, the DNA tests come back, and it was a woman. And so instead of going, it was a woman warrior, what they actually said was, that was a staff of unity. It's like, well done, guys, well done. Now, although a lot of people will start with this one and go, I'm just opening a debate, don't hate me, what they're actually saying is, I'm completely ignorant and I want you to spoon-feed all of this information I am too lazy to Google for. These are the first people who will tell new people, go and read the fucking manual, and yet, as soon as they display their own ignorance, they will say, I was just starting a debate. If you ever find yourself saying, well, I don't know about this, but, or if you ever find yourself saying, well, men are naturally better than women at programming, to quote the great Bill Hicks, kill yourself now, this isn't a joke. Because you don't actually have to go that far to find research where it works, where they actually explain where this difference comes from. Carol Dweck did her lifetime of research on why there was a difference between performance in young men and young women in mathematics. Is mathematics a gift? She theorized that maybe it wasn't just some had penises and some didn't. Maybe it was because some were told they were good at things and they would be naturally good, and some were told no matter how hard they tried, they would always fail. And in mathematics courses, they tended to romanticize the heroes of mathematics. They tend to say that they just magicked up all of these equations and pretend that they didn't spend night after night after night working on these hard problems just to get them solved. So when they started looking at the classes originally, the boys were outperforming the girls by quite a significant margin. So they sat them down and went, it doesn't matter. What matters is how hard. This is hard. And if you work at it, you will find that you can do it. And with just this simple intervention, telling people that it's not genetic, it's not biological, it's all about sheer hard work, something really strange happened. The girls did as well as the boys, but that wasn't the strange thing. Both groups did better than the original group. It turns out this sort of mythos that you have to be born to be a programmer affects everyone, but it affects women and other people in minorities in tech even more so. It's called a stereotype threat. So if you are teaching today, make sure you tell your students, just work at it. It's not what you're born with, it's what you make of it. And you will find they will all do better. A similar myth is the 10 times programmer. The idea that somehow you can hire a software rock star or a ninja. We've all seen these terms in various other Hacker News job adverts. Looking for a 10 times programmer. In fact, Penny Arcade recently advertised for a strong, competent graduate programmer to do 4 different jobs for the pay of less than 1. What this division is actually about is saying we need to find young, naive programmers who will happily work 80-hour weeks for no money whatsoever. Whenever you see 10-time programmers, and remember, people who like this myth will always say, well, I know I'm 10 times better. They actually haven't done any research. They haven't looked out into where this myth came from. And where this myth came from is in the 60s. They sat down 12 people for half an hour, half on punch cards, half in front of a terminal, and found out that using a terminal was much faster than using punch cards. And this is where the myth comes from, that punch cards are slow, but now what it means is I'm a special super snowflake programmer. I am so amazing that I outperform a group of 10. The reality is 10 programmers is just more expensive, and not only that, 10 programmers will have a broader experience on which to draw on. None of the software you have ever used has been written by a 10 times programmer. None of the software on your laptops right now has been written by one person in absolute isolation. Almost every piece of software on your laptop has been written by a group, written by a team, collaborating and communicating. So, although it's very easy to talk about what makes a good and what makes a bad programmer, what programmers actually mean whenever they say, you know what good programmers are, they mean this. Eric S. Raymond wrote a paper called How to Be a Hacker when he wasn't busy writing angry racist rants about Muslims. And what that was a step-by-step instruction on how to be Eric S. Raymond, because that was the only good programmer he could think of. Whenever you see how to be a good programmer, what you are actually reading is how to copy me, how to cargo cult my personality, how to repeat every single one of my mistakes, and you can be successful as me. If only you're born into the same rich, white, privileged family that I was, I'm sure it will all work out. The reality is we have no idea what makes a good and a bad programmer, and you all know this already because you will have gone to an interview where they say, well, we just don't know how to find good candidates. we don't know what we're doing in computer interviews. And in many cases, what they will do is instead of asking them how good they are at programming, they will ask them, how would you move a mountain with a teaspoon? Why are manhole covers round? Or I once got asked, how much Teflon is there in the universe? Just give us an answer. So if you ever have an interview where somebody asks you one of these screwball questions, can you think what you should do? Anyone? Yep. You should get the fuck out of there as quickly as possible. Places that ask these sorts of questions are not asking, can you program? They are asking, will you put up with arbitrary bullshit from management? There is actually, again, some more evidence. There's a thing called the Wasson-Crick selection task, which was a test designed to show that people don't check for things that prove them wrong. They only look for things that prove themselves right. But as they did this task, they found out that when they were dealing with it in the abstract way and asking people with playing cards, everybody failed. But when they started changing it and asking people about drinking ages and social events, everybody got it right. It turns out what it did show, more than people don't look for ways to prove themselves wrong, was that problem-solving ability is deeply linked to the domain that you are solving. There is no such thing as an abstract problem-solving ability. So if you're asking somebody how good they are at programming, you should really stick to asking questions about programming, because asking questions about manholes only tells you how good they are at quiz shows and party games. Now, occasionally people will ask a programming puzzle question, like how do you reverse a linked list? And my advice is slightly different. Don't leave, just ask, when was the last time you used this in production? And the interviewer will slowly curl up and go, we've never really done anything like that. You won't get the job, but it's really fun to make them feel awkward for doing such bad things. I was told I was not a cultural fit for asking these questions. But really, when we're not learning from our mistakes, we're teaching our mistakes. We don't know what makes good and bad programmers, and we still don't know how to teach people to be good programmers. When people ask a programmer, how should I learn to program, what they say is, you should repeat my mistakes exactly. I have honed and perfected my mistakes over these years. I learned on an 80s machine with 8 bits, that's what you should learn on. This was my first language, that's what you should do. It's driven by nostalgia, the belief that somehow how they learned was the best way, how they enjoyed learning was the best way. It's very narcissistic. The reality is when you're teaching someone, you should be listening, you should be finding out what they want to get out of it, what they want to learn from it. And yet still, people will say, oh, you want to learn programming? Learn C. Real hackers learn C. Operating systems are written in C. And the reality is you just want to write hello world or a thing that makes fart sounds. And even then, with people who use C are already confident in the shell, so it's always naturally a second language. Other people will say, Java, C++, C#, they're used in industry, they're for real jobs, that's what you should use. But the thing is about Java and C# is they have a very steep learning curve. They force object orientation from the outset. And I was in a university course where the tutor had given up teaching us. He just made us all chant public, static, void, main, over and over again. It was his only hope that everyone would get at least 1 mark apart from answering their name correctly. And even when you try and ask them, oh, what should I learn to program, they'll tell you what they did and how they enjoyed it. But then if you say, I'm really curious about learning to program, people like Jeff Atwood will say, don't learn to program. Programming's a serious business. It will take you 10 years to even learn as much as I have. So despite telling you to repeat their mistakes, as soon as you do it for the same reasons they did, they will tell you off. And those reasons are just curiosity and fun. We have lost all idea of why we got into it in the first place, because we were curious, we were bored, we wanted to experiment, and somehow we chastise all learners for doing exactly the same thing as us. Really, for me, programming is more than just writing apps. It's more than just building websites for clients. It's a medium for ideas. It's a place to communicate and explore ideas. It can be a place for art. It can be a place for science. It can be a place for design. But most people still think code is just about selling things in the App Store. But one person didn't. His name was Seymour Papert. He invented Logo, the programming language, and he was a professor in the MIT AI lab back in 1960. And he wrote this book, Mindstorms, Children, Computers, and Powerful Ideas. And the crux was, instead of teaching kids to code, let's teach them to think, and code is a really good way of doing this. He didn't think that children should learn to program just because they might want a job in a startup. He thought children should learn to program because it opened up this entire world for them to experiment about. And my favorite story from the MIT lab is nothing to do with really coding or mathematics. It was a young 9-year-old, and she struggled with English. She couldn't tell the difference between nouns and verbs. So her tutor said, write a sentence generator. The cat sat on the mat. So she did. Well, she tried, and it didn't really work. So she sat and debugged her problem and her program and made those faces we've all made whenever we've been debugging things. You know, why isn't it working? But after a while, it worked. And she looked, and suddenly she leapt up and ran around the lab going, I know what a noun is! I know what a noun is! In another case, Mitch Resnick, who's been following on from Seymour Papert, got thanked personally for teaching somebody what a variable is. The kid was absolutely excited. He finally found a new way to make his game work. Kids are really excited about being able to do their own ideas on computers. To me, programming is actually the ultimate sandbox game. It's far better than Minecraft. And computer is a lever long enough to move the world. So I don't just want to put it in children's hands, I want to put it in everyone's hands. Now, despite being a very cynical opening about how everything's breaking and how we're not getting things right and how we're really not helping people, the youth, children to learn, to express themselves, to communicate and play, I'm actually still quite an optimist. And you can tell I'm an optimist because I say those words that every other programmer says. You would think that. Every programmer has to be optimistic, otherwise we would just go mad. We would be curling up into a ball, rocking backwards, forwards, and crying. Every time you find yourself saying you would think that, you are being an optimist. You'd think that this lift would work. You'd think that the conference Wi-Fi would work. You'd think these things would run on time. You have this natural assumption that things should just work, and you are frustrated when they don't. That is optimism. Cynicism is knowing that it might not actually be the case, but we still want things to work. We still try and make things better. And that's thankfully what my day job is now, trying to make things better. I work for a company called Code Club, and we get volunteers to go into schools around the UK to help kids learn to play with code. Now, we're not going to turn them into entrepreneurs. We're not going to turn them into whiz-kid programmers overnight. But I have to say, when you see a 9-year-old running giddily around a room because their game just worked, it kind of makes it all worthwhile. A year ago, Linda and Claire sat down and realized that education in the UK for computers was broken. It was all about Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, business skills, administration. It was as if we'd handed out a bunch of synthesizers to the entire primary schools across the UK and taught kids to press the demo button over and over and over again. As if we'd taken children around an art gallery, and as soon as they got home and picked up a pack of crayons, they went, no, not for you. You want to make art, hire a real artist. So in those 18 months Code Club has been around, we now have 1,400 clubs in the UK and a couple more around the world. All of our material is online and on GitHub and translated, and we are on almost every continent, and we are working on Antarctica. Linda will be giving a talk about Code Club tomorrow, and I highly recommend it, obviously. But I won't try and spoil the rest of her talk now. But this isn't the only thing you can do. As much as it's good to bring kids into programming, it's good not to kick adults out of programming. As much as there's been talk about bringing more people into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and manufacturing? Mathematics, sorry. Many people who come into programming leave. They just don't like the culture. And in one case, a friend of mine, Rachel, went to her local Ruby group and found out it was infested with programmers. Not too many, but they were just out of control. There was just lots of slurs, there was lots of cheap remarks, and she just didn't feel welcome anymore and said, I still want to go to the pub. I still want to talk to my friends about programming. What am I going to do? So I said, we'll make our own meetup with a code of conduct, and we'll go to the bar. And so we did, and I wrote up a quick manifesto saying, tell you what, let's make an inclusive meetup. Let's make a meetup for not just people who feel that they're excluded from normal meetups. Let's try and bring people who wouldn't even think to go to one in the first place. And we used the term imposters welcome. Anyone who feels that they're not welcome, anyone who feels that they're just not good enough, anyone who feels they're not as smart as the people who write angry comments on Hacker News, they now have a place to turn up to the pub. And I thought, okay, we'll get about 5 people turning up in London, we'll have a nice time. Within a week, we had 8 different meetings around the world. It had already been translated into German. 2 months on, we have 8 in the UK, 3 in Europe, another 6 in America. And it still seems to be growing. It turns out that we're not the only ones who want to make an improvement. We're not the only ones who don't want to feel alone, and we're also not the only ones who want to just sit down without being made to feel an idiot and go, oh, computers, oh. But really, I know I'm a bad programmer, but that hasn't stopped me trying to change things. And I know things are pretty awful, but that shouldn't stop you trying to change things. You're not going to get it right. You're not going to get it perfect. Just like when you've written your program, nobody expects to get their program right first time, so no one should expect to fix the programming culture to make it right first time. But there's always something you can do. Even if it's just going into a school and giddily excited at children. Maybe it's bringing a friend and helping them learn to understand some of the bits on their website that they've really struggled with. Or maybe it's just not making that cheap joke that you know would be funny, but actually is really quite harmful. There is always something you can do to make the world suck less. So hopefully we can all try and make the world a better place, but I'm not sure if that's my goal. I think my ultimate goal in life is to serve as an example to others. Really, I don't want people to repeat my mistakes. I want people to make new and interesting mistakes, because that's really how we progress. Thanks.